Hi everyone, we've got a cracking episode here with Alex Kaloyanides about religious history in 19th century Myanmar. But I just wanted to quickly say that as I was editing this episode, I realised this was the 50th episode of Myanmar Musings. So I just wanted to say thank you to everybody who listens. And as long as you keep listening, I'll keep recording these podcasts. But without further ado, here we go. Cheers. Welcome to Myanmar Musings, a podcast of the Myanmar Research Centre at the Australian National University, Canberra. I'm Luke Corbin. It's August 21, 2020, and today we are speaking with Dr Alex Kaloyanides, Assistant Professor in Religious Studies at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. Alex began her scholarly career by writing a religious history of the 19th century American Baptist mission to Burma, and continues to research and hold an interest in this pivotal period in Burmese history. Hello, Alex.
Hello, thank you for having me.
It's my pleasure. Now, I think many listeners, many people will know that the 19th century saw three wars between the British and the Burmese, culminating in the exile of the Theravada Buddhist Myanmar king and end of the monarchy, and then the beginning of direct British colonial rule, a tumultuous century. But in and around these political events, there were other sites of encounter between Western and Burmese ideas, such as in trade and religion. So I wonder first, what is a Baptist compared to another kind of Christian? And then, who were the American Baptist missionaries that came to Burma that you find so interesting, and where did they prosecute their cause? Please relate to us this story of encounter.
All right, so a Baptist is a form of, is a Protestant Christian, and what distinguishes Baptist Christians is their belief that the rite of baptism, the admission into the church, should be reserved for professing believers. So, other churches will baptize babies, shortly after they're born. They'll take an infant to a church, get rid of its original sin as soon as they can through baptism. But the Baptists say that you have to be a mature individual who can express your faith, who can show that you have this belief, and that then you can go through the baptismal process. And for Baptists, it's a total immersive experience. Your body is fully in the water, whereas other churches, there might be just a little sprinkling or, pouring some water over a head. For the Baptists, this is a really important site, mostly for adults, and what happens is this full immersion. So that's what distinguishes the Baptists. And it's a very popular form of Protestant Christianity throughout the world. And now in Myanmar, it is one of the most prominent, if not the most prominent, forms of Christianity. And that is in large part due to this American Baptist mission, as you said in your kind introduction, that this is what I have been working on. And I've been really interested in this mission. It began in 1813. So this is before the beginning of the Anglo-Burmese Wars. And these missionaries were really just interesting people. I hadn't known much about the history of missions before I got into this. And some of the scholarship I had seen sort of had assumed that they were sort of largely hostile to Asian religions and traditions. But when I started finding these letters and manuscripts, I became much more interested in these people who were young people in their 20s who leave the United States. The United States was a new country. They just recently achieved independence. And there's this fervor, this evangelical Christian fervor in the States. And they start learning about, London missionary societies. And they start learning about India through the British press. And they're like, we want to go, let's do this thing. And so they get on a boat, and there's just a small group of them. They're the first people to leave as foreign missionaries, leave the continent. And they're trying to go to India because that's the spot, and they arrive 4 months later in Madras. And, in India, they're like, no, we're not interested in having you missionaries here. The local communities, the British, they were like, no, you can't come in. And so at this point, these young missionaries, including this couple, Adoniram Judson and his wife, Ann Judson, were trying to figure out what to do. Ann Judson was sick, and there was one ship in the harbor leaving to cross the Bay of Bengal, this Georgiana, this 3-masted sailing vessel that takes them to Rangoon. So they sort of end up there by accident, but then they stay, they live out their lives. Anne is shorter, she dies at the age of 36. But Adoniram lives much older, and he has this really sort of celebrated career in some quarters for not only sort of establishing this Baptist mission and the Baptist church, but doing translation work. People are familiar with his Burmese English dictionary, and for doing the first full translation of the Bible into Burmese. So he ends up sort of going down a more academic path. But the story of the mission, especially when he ends up involved, he gets imprisoned during the first Anglo-Burmese War. He's released to serve as a translator for the king. So these stories are circulating, and people start learning more about this mission, and missionaries follow him to Burma, and it becomes this popular mission. At least in the press, it totally fails among the Bamar, and Buddhists don't baptize in big numbers, but it does have some success among minority communities, especially the Karen at first, the Chin and the Kachin later. And they stick around for a while. They're there throughout the Anglo-Burmese War period, through colonization, into the 20th century. And so it becomes this important mission in a lot of ways, the sort of establishment of the Baptist Church, both for Burmese history, but also for sort of American Christian religious history.
Yeah, when I've been up in Chin State recently, you go to some valleys, and one village is one denomination of Christianity, another village is another denomination of Christianity, and they're not so far away from one another. So you said that the Baptist mission first went to Gayin State, and then later on to Kachin and Chin State. Could you maybe paint this a little bit more temporally? Like, how did two kind of pioneer missionaries begin in this capital city and then develop out into what was incredibly, remote kind of countryside back then, where there weren't roads or anything like that?
Yeah, so the ideal for this form of evangelical work was to be an itinerant preacher. The model was to be someone who spoke the word. So first you had to go and learn the languages. So they spent a lot of time doing that in Rangoon and other sort of places, mostly in Lower Burma. But they were learning the languages, and then what they really wanted to do was get out. They wanted to go on these tours where they would be hiking for, they would wait till the dry season, and then they would spend a really long time. They would have a lot of, they would have local converts help them, and they would make these trips as they could going out. And so the dream was to be one of these itinerant preachers. They proved more successful in terms of these missions that they established, where they would set up schools in different places. But even the people that were running these kinds of schools or these home missions would still take time every year to try and go on one of these, what they call them, these tours, or jungle tours is sort of the language of the time. And they were really committed to doing that. So you have these, Eugenio Kincaid is one of these missionaries who's always writing about, seeing, these elephants and tigers and, all of these adventures they're on. So they were really committed to really trying to do this spoken preaching, to going out and traveling. And often it was the men, but then the women started going. Women started being seen in the mission as sort of better speakers. They were better at Burmese and other languages. And so they would move out. And so they would try and go as remote as they could, especially as into the 1840s, when they really saw how much they were failing to make any inroads into the Bamar population. They started setting up these other networks, and sometimes they were very remote. And it wasn't until rail lines were established that people could really easily travel back to these more urban centers.
You think that this American evangelization influenced, although maybe not many Burma Buddhists were converted, it influenced Burmese Buddhist Reformation movements within Buddhism. How so?
Well, to be honest, there weren't that many American missionaries. It started out with a few, and then there were dozens, hundreds, and at the most thousands. So the numbers of actual missionaries and their convert populations never were that big. So of course, for the Buddhist Reformation movements that were happening at the same time of the mission, basically the period I look at is 1813 through 1885, 86, the end of the Anglo-Burmese War period. The bigger things, of course, that are happening are this longer tradition of Reformation movements that Burma's had, that even in the larger Theravada world in Sri Lanka and India. So that those kinds of ideas of the court, the kings purifying the Sangha, that's been going on. And that was much more important, as was the colonization, of course. But I became interested to think about these particular missionaries because I think that although there were very few, they did some things that were sort of bigger than them. Two sort of prominent examples. One, they introduced the printing press in 1816. So you have this guy, Hugh, come over from the States with a typewriter and a printing press, and this has a huge impact in Burma as it does in other places, of course. And then also this network of schools. The American Baptists set up these schools, home schools, boarding schools, and it was such a prominent tradition that they were establishing that once the British started colonizing, they relied on these American schools, funded these American schools, and used these American schools as an alternative to the Buddhist monastic education system in the country, as a way to train surveyors, other bureaucrats, English language work. And they were not restricted only to Christians or converts or Eurasians or minority groups. You know, a lot of people could go to these schools, and they even established colleges later on. And so their education system became really influential place for people not only to sort of access power, colonial power, but also to see things like, you know, globes and maps and telescopes. And American Baptists were some of the first people to bring these kinds of world conjuring devices from Western locales into places like the court. And so even though there weren't so many of them and there weren't so many people who end up becoming Baptists themselves, they had this way of influencing. And then, you know, the other thing I think about, and this isn't something that you could prove in terms of influence, but one thing when I read these stories that are written down and these accounts and these travel logs and journals and reports back, there are all of these ways that you have these American missionaries going on these tours, like I'm talking about, into remote areas and having these like religious debates. They would like cause a debate. They'd go to a pagoda on Uposatha or something, and they'd get a lot of attention. They'd be acting kind of like getting a lot of attention to themselves and handing out leaflets all over the place, pamphlets here. And they'd get all these people to get their attention, and they'd get them in these religious debates, you know, and they'd be like, oh, have you heard of this guy? You know, Jesus Christ, the Son of God, you need to know there's hell, there's all these things. And then people, you know, there'd be like an elderly lady or a guy who just sort of left the monastery, or some smart teenager would be like, yeah, you raised some interesting points, but the thing is, there's this thing called karma. You can't really have someone sort of free you of your sins, you know, you have to endure the consequences of your actions, wholesome, unwholesome, like you should know about these things. And so they're articulating their own sort of understandings of the sasana, the Buddhist tradition, back to, in a way, because you have these, you know, these aggressive missionaries going into all these places, sort of promoting a kind of Christian superiority. And so then you have people learning in a way how to respond to that. And so these articulations, which we find in the archives of the mission and other materials, which are interesting for the kind of insights into different kind of regional areas, ethnic groups, socioeconomic, you know, statuses, where people are learning to be like, no, this is what Buddhism is as a kind of comparative religion. And that was a big part of these Reformation movements. So I just found that sort of more lower level, local exchange is really interesting to think about sort of what was happening outside of courts or outside of the literati or outside of urban centers. And that became interesting to me as well.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And thinking about you know, these people hiking up to pagodas with their leaflets makes me think about the methods and the discussions. And Baptists in Burma would also relate a story. They would say that the life story of Jesus was buried in ancient Sanskrit manuscripts. Where did this idea come from, and what can we learn from this and other, as you call them, lost book legends?
Yeah, there ends up being a lot of different stories about books and manuscripts and texts in the period, especially in the first half of the 19th century, that I found to be interesting for these ways of competing and converging. So first, there's this idea that really is coming out of Europe and England at the time, as there are all of these manuscripts being unearthed from the ground and found in libraries in Kathmandu and taken in India. And you have these scholars learning Sanskrit and Pali and other Indic languages. And you have philologists realizing these connections with Greek and Latin and developing this notion of an Indo-European family, like language family. This sparked this imagination of what was kindred, India and ancient Greece and Rome as these kindred places. And as people started learning and translating, learning these languages, translating these texts, they'd find stories about, a son of a god who, was born of a virgin and different kinds of things. And there was this one guy, Claudius Buchanan, who wrote this piece called The Star in the East. And he sort of forwarded some of these ideas. And Adoniram Judson, this pioneering missionary, I found, these records of him being a young person and just being so seized by this idea, and even now you hear it, right? Did Jesus go to India? This idea that continues. So there was this fascination that there was something sort of powerful about these manuscripts, some insight, and also that it sort of suggested that there was some possibility for new Christian conversion there. And then you had stories that I think are great from different groups. Like, for example, the Quran, they'll have these stories of this notion that, that they had long ago had a written language and had a holy book, and then it was lost. Some versions, it's, a negligent son or some animals eat it or so on. Somehow this book gets lost. So that when they meet these American missionaries who are tromping through the jungle and handing them, this book, and, they say, oh, right, this is the book we've been waiting for. And when they start identifying as Christian, it's not that they're taking on some foreign or Western or white tradition. Instead, they say, oh, this is reclaiming of their own tradition. So I became really interested in that. And then I also was, when I started working in some of these archives, I was working on different kinds of studying different languages. And I knew that there was this collection of Pali texts at Brown, which is this Ivy League university, not far from where I was doing my graduate work. And so I went there and found all these Kamawa texts, and started becoming interested in the Kamawa that these missionaries were sort of taking out of Burma with them. And so all of these ways that texts as a way to carry power and themselves became really interesting and were sort of overlapping. They'd have these stories in the missionary press where some missionary would go to some village and there'd be some local, leader of the village who possessed a text that everyone would say, oh, this text is so powerful. That's why this leader is so powerful. And he'd be sitting there fanning himself and they'd say, oh, but you know English. Can you translate it for us? And the leader would unwrap it and it would be in this box, covered with ornamentation. And then inside would be maybe a copy of the Book of Common Prayer or a London business card. And the missionaries, when they would relate this story in the press, they would kind of laugh, like, look at these backward people worshiping some mundane production of the press. But there was always this uneasiness that you could also read in these reports that they themselves were promoting this kind of interest in the material power of these texts. And so I became interested in these different stories about book cultures and how they came together in this period.
Yeah, it's an amazing kind of commonality between cultures, mostly oral cultures around the world. So many of them have these lost book legends. Yeah, it's a mystery. Okay. I first contacted you for this interview after I read your most recent publication, which is just sensational. It's an article in the Journal of Burma Studies about the 1864 to 1865 Enfield rifle negotiations between the king at that time of Burma, King Mindon, and a merchant, and then the British. So this is a really fascinating story of how Mindon Min tried to buy nearly 4,000 rifles with which to arm his personal guards against a possible palace coup from within the royal family. And Mindon Min used the British demand for teak from Upper Burma as his leverage. He didn't get the rifles at first, and the coup actually did happen, leading to civil war and the murder of the well-known and the well-respected Prince Ganong, one of my favourite characters in Burmese history, who I haven't had the chance to talk about on this podcast yet. That was a tragic killing that, in my opinion, was as consequential as the assassination of Aung San 80 years later. So you write about this episode in Economics from the context of religion. What does it suggest about the ways that scholars of Burmese religions should think about economics and Western influence and religion in the 19th century?
Yeah, thanks for this, Luke. I've been really excited to talk to you about this. This is sort of some new research I'm doing into the teak industry. And it really just sort of happened by chance because I found these documents about these negotiations for Enfield rifles and teak. And the argument that Mindon Min makes is that that teak is Buddhist, and therefore he has the right to withhold it. And the British accept this argument. They're like, oh, I guess he can kind of play the Buddhism card, and we won't get our teak. And they needed teak because they had depleted their oak forests and needed teak, this tropical hardwood for shipbuilding. So he makes this argument. And so I was like, what is Buddhist about teak? How could tree or timber be Buddhist? Like, what is this about? And I kind of went in these rabbit holes in the Pali Canon about, this notion that this relationship between the Buddha and this teak grove that I tell about in the article. But in the end, it just seemed to be these other practices that were happening, royal practices of monopolies and taxations, these ideas of righteous kings, how they are supposed to be, how they can accept certain kinds of taxes, sort of like the traditional form would be certain portions of rice and so on. And I became really interested in this relationship between sort of the Buddhist tradition and taxation and economic practices, and also the introduction of, Western laissez-faire capitalism, the scientific forestry that they introduce through the teak business, and all of these things happening at the same time. And it seems to me it's an example of how, if we think about religion with economics, there are things that we can learn. And other fields do this, more, bigger fields, have been thinking about religion and economics. For example, I've done work in American religious history, and there's new work coming out recently about the history of the oil industry and how oil in North America, this sort of Christianity and oil came together to make America. And I think there's an opportunity to think about trade, economics, and power, material mediations, and so on, that we could do a lot more with. And I that's what I'd like to do. So I want to hear from you actually with the beer industry, if you see anything, if there would be a way, people obviously have been studying economics, and there's, especially in the contemporary situation, and people have been studying, religion, and people look at, sometimes look at them together, but it seems like there's more opportunity there because it's questions of how meaning is made and how power is organized. And so, do you see something like this with the beer industry and the way that sort of ideas about alcohol and consumption and nationalism, these must be things that you think about as well?
Yeah, it is. The first thing that I keep coming up against is that beer is either an incredibly broad category in Myanmar or a really, really narrow one. So if you look at it from a sort of outside production perspective, then beer is incredibly diverse and encompasses all these different religious beliefs because people have been making it for hundreds of years, all these different communities, different animist traditions, then influenced by Christianity. And then actually the Burma Buddhists are the only kind of people that don't have as storied a tradition of beer brewing as the other communities. They make wine with what they call it tangi, toddy, arak. But then if you go to what beer means now and today, then I think it's firmly, associated with colonialism, imperialism, whiteness, and the Christian thing doesn't come through, but the way that Burma Buddhists regulate and interact with the drink, I think, is quite informed by Buddhism. But because this kind of beer was instituted in the country so violently, literally as soon as the king was deposed and exiled, the factory that Kanaung started that used to make armaments was just converted into a brewery that fed the troops, the British troops, and that just continued for over a century because it had that sort of such totalizing, othering sort of imposition. It's had this kind of special role in Myanmar society.
So interesting. It reminds me, I remember talking to a friend who's Kachin, and he was talking about the competing, there's all this sort of stories about the Baptists competing with Catholics. And one thing he said, he was like, the thing about the Catholics, well, they'll let you drink, you could do a lot more drinking of alcohol when you hang out with the Catholics. And so that was sort of a knock against the Baptists for that.
I mentioned before that, I spent some time in upland Myanmar, and I can say that today, in Chin State in particular, missionary activities are really current and ongoing, and you bump into these people in the hotels now, down in Galiwa and the lowlands, going up into Chin villages and continuing, I suppose, in much the same fashion. And then in Yangon, I've also encountered Mormons doing their rounds. Once was at the kind of official 135 ethnic festival filled with, ethnic food, so-called ethnic food, dancing culture, and then these Mormons just walking around. So has there been a Christianizing revival in Myanmar in recent history? What's the state of that kind of activity in Myanmar today, do you think? And have you considered turning your attention to looking into more recent missionary history?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of exciting work to be done here. I was in Myanmar in 2013 when it was the 200-year anniversary of the Baptist mission. And so there was a lot of stuff, a lot of talk about the history of the mission, the legacy of the mission. But then I was talking to people and they said, what's really happening is we've got all these Pentecostals. Like, people aren't even interested in the Baptists anymore. They consider the Baptists to be kind of either establishment, they've sort of lost their edge in a way, maybe associated more with particular minority groups. And the Pentecostals are really kind of where it's at in terms of this energy for Christianity. So, I'm not trained as an ethnographer, but I decided I'll still go out and try to interview and talk to some people in some of these sort of prominent evangelists, including this one elderly man who was really in the mid 20th century. He was popular on radio and stuff. And he said, we're doing the real work, Judson, all those guys, they were on the streets, they were doing this preaching, now everyone's all comfortable in their churches. What you really have to do is go on the trains and go out on the streets and do this kind of work. And that it's the Pentecostals that are the ones that are doing this revival. And there's a scholar, I don't think you've had him, but you should check out Michael Edwards at Cambridge. His work is really cool. And so he's looked at the contemporary stuff. So he's doing the groundbreaking work on this. And I think it's important because on the one hand, this also tells us something about the ways that the constructions of race and religion, ethnicity are all kind of come together, and how important that is, especially trying to understand some recent violence and tensions in the country. And what you have is the Pentecostals making much more inroads into Burma and sort of more upper class society. And so there's this idea, and sometimes, these Baptists would say, they have these like secret stashes of money. There'll be all these rumors about why they were doing that. And they'd say, have you seen their rings? Look at that, look at their rings, and all this kind of tension. So I do think that there's a lot of work. I prefer like working with dead people and texts, so I don't know how much I will be the one to do it. I do like doing recorded oral history. So I'd love to do more of that. But I encourage other people to do this kind of work, because I think it's important not only to explore these unexplored areas, but it also helps to decenter this notion that Burma is a land for Buddhists, that Myanmar is Buddhist, that it sort of denaturalizes it. And even, still we have so many stories to tell about mainstream Buddhism there as well. And I think it's important to do those projects. But I think that there's a risk of inadvertently repeating this idea, that sort of naturalizing the notion that it is a vastly Buddhist country. And so I think that people, that are doing this kind of work, people like Michael and others, are helping telling the stories of other religious communities, really helps us rethink the sort of the landscape and the culture there in important ways. So I hope to see more of that work.
Thank you, Alex. This has been a really awesome chat. Our last question is always, can you please give us a recommendation? It can be anything to do with Myanmar, your own research or otherwise. Have you rustled anything up for us?
Well, I would just wanted to draw some attention to the American Baptist Historical Society archives. I think there are a lot of interesting gems. I'm actually working right now on some paintings done by a Burmese artist that they have in their storage. And right now you can't visit the archives, but they have a website that you can navigate and you can look. They did a lot of different newspapers in different kinds of languages. So for those of you who do research in some of these minority languages, you might find some really cool stuff to work on there. So I encourage, and a lot of their publications, like their Baptist Missionary Magazine, have been digitized, and some of them are word searchable. And so it's a good place for those of you who are, stuck at home and trying to do some research, especially historians. I encourage you to go there, the American Baptist Historical Society.
That's a really great tip. This has been a great chat, and thank you so much for coming on Myanmar Musings.
This was so fun. Thank you so much for having me.